Awesome, just checking that you can hear me.
Yep, you're audible.
Good. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. State security apparatuses have harmed minorities for generations, and the way that communities perceive of these institutions is rooted in these historical interactions. There is a justified mistrust in these communities, and we ought not to let children from these communities empower the very groups that overpolice them. A few things in clarification before moving on to our case. What we support and would do as a member of the community in this debate is that we would discourage any child in that community from going into state security roles. This discouragement would happen in two ways. Firstly, obviously, through negative discouragement, which says that these roles would harm these children if they choose to go into them, would also cause harm to the community, would make them someone that is in opposition to the community itself, but also in positive ways by reinforcing to children that they have various options available to them. They can study and go into any normal role that would provide them with security and stability in their life, and that these state apparatuses are not the only thing they have to do. We think that this kind of encouragement works because the motion itself indicates that these are tight-knit communities of minorities where there is respect for people within that community, but also sway that all elders have. But I think there are also just scales in terms of how that influence works, in that parents will have a lot of sway with their kids, uncles and aunts and neighbors and people you are directly proximate to will have a lot of say. 3 points. Firstly, explaining what the incentives are on individuals in the minority community. Secondly, explaining why you don't want minority children joining these institutions. And finally, explaining why minority children are unlikely to change these institutions from within and the resulting harm that would accrue to these children. On incentives of an individual in that community, because obviously this motion does not just say that you are a minority, that is an individual atom in a society, but that you are a member of a minority community, meaning that you are a part of a collective, likely what is quite a strong social grouping, and that social grouping being protected and maintained for you is probably something that is of immense importance. I think the second thing to note, though, is that you likely are keenly aware of the harm that is done onto you and your community as a result of these institutions. So the very fact that over-policing means that every time you step onto the street, you see a cop car, or the fact that ICE comes into your community to bust down doors and take away and deport communities. The fact that in New Zealand, you were probably there when dawn raids were happening in the Pacific community means that you are aware of the injustices that these institutions continue to do. But I think the third thing to say is that you are also just a human being. You have emotional bonds with that community and you know the history of your community. I think that means that you're aware of things like generational trauma, which has meant that members of your community are likely to die earlier than people that make up the majority and do not face these same systemic issues. You likely do not want the future of your community to be a continuation of that suffering that has harmed your parents and their parents before them. I think what this means is that in terms of your priorities, even though you care about the individual outcomes for the child, you especially care for the outcomes of your community as a whole and as a social grouping. Why then do you not want children joining these institutions? I think the first thing to note is just that joining these institutions is incredibly bad. We give you 3 specific reasons. The first is that often these institutions have immense incentives to prey on kids to get them into jobs that some people are often quite unwilling to do. The nature of these jobs that result in security apparatuses, things like ICE, policing, and military, are roles that people from comfortable backgrounds often are unwilling to go into due to the direct threat that occurs to their life. It is much easier to be an accountant than it is to be a soldier. So what institutions like the military do is they coerce people from poor and vulnerable backgrounds, telling them this is a stable way to live their life by putting themselves at risk for stable pay. Note that without your community discouraging children from entering into these institutions, more and more children are likely to be swept up into the narratives that these institutions run to get vulnerable people involved. So there's an obligation to make sure that these institutions are not able to just exclusively prey on poor and vulnerable kids from minority backgrounds, something that they are otherwise able to do when they coerce and advertise to minority kids because they know that they are statistically less likely to have other options available to them. And in comparative, like getting free university from the military is quite good. So obviously, in a world where you are not discouraging them, more people are likely to just join these institutions because of all the advertising that happens. The second thing to say is that obviously Op might come up and say that these minorities will act nicer than white people do, but I think people from these communities are used in especially pernicious ways when they join these security apparatuses. There are a few reasons as to why. The first is that you get incentivized to work significantly harder than your colleagues because you want things like promotions and job stability within that apparatus. You're joining from a lower lower point than people from probably more privileged backgrounds than you are. So you work a lot harder than them. The second is to say, though, that training in these institutions is often like indoctrination. So you buy into the culture of that work. You truly believe that you are making a difference when you're walking as a cop on the beat and making sure that like other minorities aren't doing bad things. But the third thing to say is that obviously you are trying to prove yourself to people who are established within their career. And I think especially because these careers are doing things like attracting people who are racist, minorities want to show that they're not like other minorities in order to fit in. You are more likely to say, yeah, I am the black cop that is willing to police other black people. You should accept me into this community. But the fourth thing to say is just that often the minorities that join these institutions are forced into interacting in the same way that the people who make up the majority are, because once your community turns away from you, you have no other options. But importantly, all of this can be used in a way to weaponize these minorities against their own community, because it is likely that these people have more knowledge about what the community is like. They know where the undocumented people live. They double down in order to not lose their alternative support structure of their white colleagues when the community moves against them. So use that knowledge they have in order to attack in significantly more specific ways than the existing institution does. But the third harm is to say that you give the state significantly more legitimacy when they can hide behind the fact that minorities willingly join their institutions. Obviously, it is less reputationally bad for the police when they put black cops on the line when BLM protests are happening. But note that this is still all surface level hirings. They're still indoctrinating all of these minorities. They're still not changing structures. But now the state is significantly harder to hold to account because they're able to hide behind the fact that they do hire minorities, and those minorities are the ones that are pushing the law. So I think these communities also lose the ability to tell woke white people that the police is harmful, because the police now just hires black people and says that that is the structural change, even though racists within the upper structures of the police have no incentive to be less racist in terms of the way they police and the policies they set, but it is far harder to find the nuance in how you identify that. All of this means is that when children from communities join these institutions are able to impose significant harms onto the community. But importantly, you as an individual are in a unique position to fight back against these pernicious recruitment methods that these institutions use to indoctrinate kids. Finally, in terms of why children are unable to change institutions from within, I think the first thing to note is just obviously, as I've noted, hiring mechanisms encourage a lot of racist people to also work there, meaning that this child is likely subjected to the treatment of the people that work there. It is unlikely that just because a few children from minority backgrounds work there, there's significant enough minorities flooding in that you can entrench and remove all of the racists that already have jobs and work as their higher uppers. It makes it a lot harder for those children to move up the ladder without assimilating. The second thing to note is just that they are upholding laws that disproportionately harm their communities. I think that has an individual impact on the child insofar as personally affronting to your sense of identity when your community hates you because they have an immense distrust of these structures, even if you are part of that community, because you are the person that is reporting your friends to ICE or your parents' friends to cops. But your child also can't change any of these structures that create those policies because they're not a wonder genius. It is just one minority in the system. And I think it feels a lot worse when you can't change those structures. You feel despondency and you attach even more to the white people that are telling you that you're doing the last thing. But the final thing to say, though, is that obviously you are letting this child risk their life. The institutions like the COP, the military, ICE, like if these kids die, it is unlikely they make any change under the opposition side of the house. The alternative is obviously that you tell that kid that there are multiple options available. Things like retail work can let you live an incredibly stable life that will not cause harm to your community. So proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for what was a fine speech. I would now like to call in the first negative speaker.
Hi, am I audible? Yep. Okay,
Yep, you
great.
are.
Okay, nice. All right. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 points of setup coming from negative. First, what do we stand for? I think it's just to clarify, we are against active discouragement, but it is also not our burden to defend encouragement. So we would assume a default hands-off stance in which individuals can choose their own careers entirely based on, I think, their own realities that they've been able to find their own place in. But secondly, that active discouragement is aggressively spreading a narrative across the entire community. This is like things like stopping members from joining state security by any means necessary. And we would argue that the negative reinforcement is equally strong, if not stronger, than positive incentives, because one, there's a necessity. Even though there's respect for members of the community, this cannot be weighed against a child's individual passion. But two, that the actor feels so strongly against state security that they will be viciously against them to the point of disillusioning children, right? We're going to mechanize this and impact what this looks like later, but let's go on to the second point of setup then, the context. In the wake of BLM, criticism of the structures, and etc., there is sufficient mitigation against the worst abuses against these minorities. Things like currently public perception matters a lot to these institutions because we give the police, immigration, and etc. autonomy if the people can trust them. Given that the media coverage is hyper-focused on abuses and corruption, people reporting on these abuses is at an all-time high. So these institutions are pressured to show reform in order to increase their budget or escape punishment. And this means that these institutions are disincentivized to engage with the worst forms of hate crimes. So just to clarify, I think one, coming from Affirmative so far, they've been completely unnuanced. I think they're only able to explain that there is injustice that exists, but they are not nuanced to how society works currently. But secondly, this frame engages with the idea coming from Affirmative about how minorities get sucked into the culture of the state apparatus that turns them to be less sensitive to their community, because clearly there are other mitigating factors that exist on our side. Before I go on to my arguments, just a call out just the flag specifically. They tried to prove that minorities are subject to coercion by people of authority within the structures of the apparatus, but it is unclear why this is something that is unique to specifically state apparatus. I think they're not able to draw the distinction between this and, for example, working as an accountant in a company where you are still beholden to more like the authoritative actors who might also be from a majority community. So I think it's unclear then why this is exclusive to this. They are not fully proving their burden. The rest of my responses are going to be integrated. First argument, why this worsens interactions between majority and minority communities. So how is this likely to be taught? So I think first, this would mean that the actor in this debate's active discouragement needs to be strong and effective, and they will most likely use emotions, right? So they will invoke personal stories of relatives within the community getting harassed or even killed by state apparatus. They will explain how their community is disproportionately searched and investigated by state security. So this includes disrespect and perhaps even charge slurs against minorities, which are unavoidable with cases like these. This is important because children are as impressionable as possible, greatly emotional, and even if this starts out as fear, it easily transitions to a deep sense of anger and resentment against the state until adulthood once they get older and stronger. And I think this is quite important strategically because in convincing a few people who wanted to be security officers not to, a narrative is created that influences the entire minority community, giving them all mindsets which we will prove is harmful. I think the impacts are simple. So first, why does this increase hostility between the state services and the minority community? Two levels under this. First, on the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that state security already disproportionately suspects minorities, and minorities will be hostile or more on edge whenever there are confrontations within the state, which makes the state actors on edge as well. You just fuel the cycle. This means that minorities will be more likely to be distrustful of the state as a whole. Things like one, state security represents the law and the state, enforces things like following traffic regulations, filing taxes, and blue-collar jobs are more likely to be, I think, challenged. But secondly, that they are less likely to get conventional jobs, comply with state documentation for these things, and turn perhaps to a life of crime because they have no alternatives. I think this is important because it shows that it ruins any chance for internal reform when generals, leaders, etc. can point at you and demonize you and use that as a justification for harming your minority community. But the second impact then, why does this ruin any chance of integration between the minority and majority? I think it's quite simple. The way in which it is taught creates a behavior of disobedience. Because if you are identified as not following instructions or showing anger towards officers, you will be seen as violent, which ruins any chance of compromise. And I think this is worse when you look at the sentiments that are going to be directed towards children and how they are unable to fully process this at that point in time. But then let's clarify, to wrap up this argument, why is this in the interest of a member from a minority community? I think first, they're naturally affected by the way the state apparatus is run. So policemen in their communities and how they act directly affect how safe this individual feels. But secondly, the diversity or lack thereof also affects the way people within their community act to towards them. A world where there's less hostility is a world where, even if white policemen are stationed in African American communities, which are again not completely likely, they are less likely to operate like shoot to kill because you don't have that sense of disobedience or that sense of animosity. Second argument then, how we improve empathy and quality of life for minorities within these institutions. So first level, on increased empathy with all missions. So just to clarify, police are usually assigned where it is most efficient. So they're assigned to areas that they're more familiar with, right? Things like immigration officers are assigned randomly, but have a higher chance of interviewing or assessing members of their own or similar communities. We agree that they have to follow guidelines and orders, but in those interactions, they can show far more empathy than a white person. So for example, someone who is Mexican can better understand the living conditions there and can be more inclined to allow someone to migrate. And a police officer can be far more gentle and less likely to use violence when dealing with someone with their own ethnicity. And note that even if there are certain structures and authorities that do exist, this is still possible because these interactions exist like sometimes outside of the frame of an authoritative figure breathing down your neck. The second level of this argument then is that just the idea of having more minorities there. And that means two things. One, safe spaces, because you have people you can relate to and talk to about your struggles. And this is especially important because in the police and the immigration officers, you have a hard time connecting with the majority. But on the second level of lobbying power, realistically, you won't be able to change the structure if you're a low-level police officer, but you can get more people to support you in filing a complaint. Other officers are threatened to mess with you because you have a community that will protect you that is currently still growing and still has to grow to be stronger. But the next level of this argument is how rising through the ranks in the chain of command becomes like what that looks like is individual decisions, right? So even within and things like trying to deal with racist communities, for example, are things that you can directly deal with, even if you are still at the hand of under the hand of your authoritative figure. You can still act in your own interest in one way, right? But why is this in the interest of someone from a minority community? One, minorities within state services are extremely vulnerable, especially when you believe the characterization given by Affirmative. They have no one to talk to, are subject to abuses daily, and we are able to give the better conditions for people there. But Affirmative also has to deal with their worst case. What if discouragement doesn't work and children still enlist or sign up? For those cases, we are able to make their lives better. But just very quickly then, on the last idea, regardless of outcomes, note that our impacts apply across the entire community because presumably you're going to be teaching this to maybe more than one child over a period of time. But even if we look at one person dealing with a child, we still win the debate because as a member of a minority, this individual is likely to know what it feels like to have their choices taken away from them. And it is worse for the child when you become yet another force that limits their choices and disillusions them from feeling like they're capable of making change from these positions.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. I would now like to call in the second affirmative speaker.
Hi, am I audible? Yeah?
Yes, you are.
Awesome. Just give me 1 second. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The negative case relies on this characterization of what it means to be an individual living in a minority community in the status quo. They seem to think that this discouragement of joining state security apparatuses is what creates hostility between these communities and the state. But that is just simply not true, right? Like just empirically, if you look at how minorities and minority communities have been treated throughout the years, that is a long-lasting historical relationship with the state that has been one of over-policing and oppression, and things like dawn raids in New Zealand that have targeted individuals of minority communities in a way that makes them significantly not trust that state. So to that extent, what side negative has done for you today is actually show that not many individuals would join these states apparatuses in the first place. That means that a lot of their benefits was rely on a lot of individuals moving into those sectors without active encouragement on their side is essential for a lot of their benefits to come about. But note, all of Umbar's harms about some minorities might be joining in the status quo that we can prevent are harms in and of itself, because there are about a couple of individuals moving into those instances where those individuals alone cause more harms. But beyond that, I think there's this relatively principal layer here as to why, if this individual cares so much about this idea of their own community joining the very sectors that harm their community, and that they have to be very emotional about it, that's probably an emotional benefit then for this actor to make sure that doesn't happen. I'm going to go through why minorities joining these institutions is actually bad for communities, and therefore responding to a lot of their analysis, and then go on to impact what they haven't responded to, right? Why these children themselves undergo significant harms by moving into those sectors, and why there are much better places for them in our comparative in order for them to have the exact same benefits of providing a community for their or support structures for their own community. That looks like moving into social services, right? Or moving into community help to help the individuals from those communities. Note there then that the actual discouragement is about state security apparatuses and not necessarily against the state. So you can make a distinguishment between the types of institutions that have historically harmed you and continue to harm you, because you're playing on the lived experiences of everyone around you, right? Of your lived experiences, you were probably harmed way more, for example, by the police than by, Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, or other sort of health and social services that do come to help you. So that kind of distinction can be made. Why is it bad for these minorities to join? Why is it bad for communities themselves when people join those institutions? The first thing to note is whether they can change that system in any significant way. This is involved in creating empathy, for example. The first thing to note is that you have no option if you join those institutions but to buy in completely, because you lose connection with your community and you're perceived as a traitor. Why is this true? The first is what I've already brought you in setup, that the community in general has historic distrust of those institutions. But secondly, you're buying into then selling out narratives of having joined the enemy. And note, this is not particularly created by the discouragement. It's created through the historical narratives and the historical experiences that have happened. So even without the active discouragement that we do on their side of the house, that level of narrative still exists, because you are still joining the police that have killed African Americans in the status quo. You're still joining the immigration services that knock down your neighbors' doors and deport them and tear their families apart, right? So without the discouragement, that level of hostility still exists. So even if it's not at the start, once you start participating in the action, and you necessarily have to then be present in, for example, a raid on an undocumented immigrant and tear their house down, because you are part of that system, and therefore you can't opt out of doing that. Otherwise, you would just be fired, right? Or you would be put on a beat detail with no actual benefits or all that stuff. That is when that traitor narrative starts. So already then it's unclear, first of all, whether you as an actor, as a child in that system, would have any empathy with the community that now treats you as a traitor. It's unclear whether your community feels okay coming up to a black cop because they are part of the enemy in general, because they're wearing that uniform and they're taking part in the things that oppress you. So the outcome specifically for their benefits is that you're unlikely to get the level of connection just because you've got a minority in those institutions. But for that individual, they have no other support structure to fall back on. So they're likely to buy in completely into that culture around you. What is that culture around you? It's racist colleagues and racist white bosses that push you to prove yourself, to make you fit in so that you can actually move up the ladder or not incur significant harms in the workplace when people are being racist towards you and calling you the very problem that they are there to stop. Which means then again that you're likely on their side of the house as well, without that discouragement, to be hostile to your own community. The second thing to note is policy is decided at the top level. They want to say you can have small de-escalation factors when you're the person there in the community. But obviously, if the white racist structures around you don't trust you, they're not going to let you do that by themselves, right? They often test you. So you are a minority officer with white officers around you, and they check whether you are actually doing your job in being as bad as the white officers are, because that's how they think they should be doing their job. So that means then that throughout that process, you're likely, first of all, to to brand yourself as the enemy of the people because you'll be forced to do certain things, or in general, the perception around you when you're surrounded by white cops that are your colleagues doing bad things is that you're bad. That plus the indoctrination that wasn't responded to shows that in their best case, it's unclear whether you're able to get that level of empathy and solution. But not already that the empathy they wanted to create or the lack of empathy that they suggest would happen on our side of the house is not necessarily caused by that discouragement. Let's talk deeper about that kind of discouragement, right? Because they say that in order to make sure that people don't join those institutions, you just need to be anti-state completely. Now, first thing to note is that that is not necessarily the case, and they just asserted that just because you're emotional about it, that you're likely to go so far. But I've already explained why it's unlikely to be towards the state as a whole, but to those specific state services. So, for example, the line that all cops are bad is about cops, right? So those narratives are very specific towards those actors, and it can be that specific because there are very specific instances of interactions with those institutions that can be pointed out as bad. That doesn't necessarily mean that you buy out of documentation that you necessarily need to get all the other jobs that they would have to do on our side of the house. Doesn't necessarily mean that you buy out completely of the state, because there are obviously institutions in the state other than those security institutions that are there to support you. Why would you also on a second level, now that dealt with their case, not actually want to do this? The first thing to note is that often these areas are pretty dangerous jobs to do, right? Especially if you've grown up in that area and have, like, you know, if it's particularly bad crime area, you are then likely to face the same pressures as any other cop in that area, worried about whether you're going to get shot if guns are on the street. So you're likely to act as much as you can in that same way, because you've also had the same training that all other white cops have had that make you scared, right? You also have police unions to fall back on, so it's unlikely that you're going to be relatively nice when you are at risk yourself. But the important thing to note is that the individual, the actor, doesn't want individuals from your community to undergo that kind of stress and trauma, right? Principally, you have generational trauma of people in your community dying. You don't want that to continue. You don't want them to be in a position that is actively hostile against any group, let alone your own community. The final thing to note in terms of disobedience, as I've already explained, and whether the world is better at this in the status quo, is that it's not necessarily true, right? BLM hasn't created sufficient integration. Like, what has actually changed? Like, police unions are still as strong as ever, and there's very little accountability that happens on any other police officer besides the one that direct Chauvin in the status quo. Public perception might have pressure in the status quo, but they change it, right? Now you don't need to necessarily change the policies behind the over policing, but just can have a minority officer and say, hey, we've solved racism in the police force. That is the cost that they have on their side.
I thank the speaker for their speech. Would now like to call in the second negative.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Visible? All right. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before I get to my extension, 2 deadlocks I need to break. Firstly, is it the active discouragement that creates this divide, or is it historical hatred? Secondly, how are minorities who want to join state security likely to respond? And then lastly, obviously, like, even in the worst case, where do we fracture the community, and why should we just let people be? Okay, most of the second half's benefits are contingent on proving that it's truly not the active discouragement that created the divide, and historical hatred cannot be reversed. 3 levels to this. Firstly, you are actually not these minorities are not so affected by historical hatred as you claim. Because historically, why will the average minority be as prejudiced as the cops that oppress them? If they are victims of prejudice and generalizations, this is exactly what they fight against, and therefore they're not going to make sweeping generalizations about how all cops act a certain way. But in status quo, even if they do hate other cops because it's unavoidable because of how like historically oppressed they are, that doesn't mean they'll hate their own community's cops necessarily. There's usually this cultivating narrative, right? That if you do want to become a cop, that you just need to be better than the rest of the cops, and you can insert your own community's values in that. You should change the system from within. This is the actual more likely and more realistic perception these minorities have, because they know that these cops can never be avoided and they can't always just be fighting with the law or coexist outside the law, right? That's why, especially in minority communities, fighting crime is often romanticized because that's their way to change the system from within, with honest labor, etc., etc. More importantly, you can always reverse generational trauma if it does exist. Each child who wants to become a cop is a brand new slate who is impressionable however you want to change it. If you yourself as a minority choose to influence as many kids around you and encourage them positively in these kinds of ways, you can easily reverse generational trauma. But let's assume the best case, right? Even if the community hates cops, firstly, we think your community can weigh off your decision to become a cop with their other interests, because realize that they've given the analysis to show us like why the state security is so lucrative for a minority, right? Given the fact that they cannot afford university otherwise because they're disenfranchised, right? Given the fact that they have free education and that's the only way sometimes they can go to college, then therefore your community knows that you can get rich off of this and help the community later on, and they're likely to respect your decision, not necessarily hate on you at the end of the day. But even in the very worst case where they do hate on you, we tell you that this doesn't engage in their own characterization, which is that in status quo, there is a massive incentive. There has been historically a massive incentive for minorities to join the police force, and therefore there's already a massive amount of them within the police force. Affirmative does not get to restart the world. This is a policy that actors will do in the status quo, so they cannot change the fact that they've proven that there's already so many minorities in the chain of command. The fact that, yeah, this was the way that in the past, minorities got free education and the state actually favored them and gave them comparatively good benefits, means that a lot of the minority is already in the police force. So if anyone is fracturing the community, it's actually them, because there's cognitive dissonance between people who are already in the police force right now because of the monetary incentive and those that you're trying to stop from going in there. But more importantly, given this reframe and why we've broken that deadlock, what are the impacts? Firstly, we only improve the situation for minorities when we have as many of them as possible, right? If you tell us that, that the minorities are becoming brainwashed or forced to engage in the culture, then you have to respond to the multiple levels we gave you at first negative. The fact that you can only get lobbying power to change the culture when you have a large amount and a sustainable amount of individuals continually joining the police force, so that the white individuals in it cannot bully those other people out. The counterfactual is that on their side, they still have a lot of white people wanting to join the police force. Just because they're not as disenfranchised as minorities doesn't mean they won't pass up on free university education, which you've said is so alluring. So that's where we have a completely white police force, and that's where these minorities are forced to become a minority within the police force in and of itself, and they're bullied and all those kinds of things. We can only create safe spaces and lobbying power on negative. But more importantly, the fact that minorities will always have an individual choice to be empathetic. And this is where I break the second deadlock, right? How will minorities who want to join state security likely respond? AF says that these actors will be manipulated by the state and follow whatever orders they're told. We told you from first negative that they're likely to be empathetic. They will still care enough about their community to resist abusive orders, stuff like that. To break this deadlock, it's about proving the likelihood that the monetary incentive for actors overpowers all other incentives that they have. And this clearly doesn't, because we preempted this when we told you active discouragement actually addresses a certain amount of people. It's not like we're encouraging people to get in there. So obviously, granted, the minorities who join the police force just for money will easily be corrupted by the state. But who are the actors that we're influencing with this policy on affirmative? These are the people who know the disincentives of joining the police force, who know that the police force is anti their minority and the fact that, I don't know, there are harsh working conditions, but they still choose necessarily to join the police force. If they just wanted money, then they would have gone to the retail jobs that you want on affirmative. But on negative, that's why the people that we want to retain within the police force from these minorities are those who are really passionate about fighting crime, are really passionate about changing the system for the sake of their minority at the end of the day. That's why you have to believe us that they're likely to be empathetic, right? That they're likely to resist orders that they're told to be against the community. But what's the worst case we have to defend then? Fine. In the worst case, we have to accept that because these minorities resist orders, they might be fired at the end of the day. We still have enough accountability for this because of the mitigation that we've given from first negative. We told you that BLM is succeeding, the fact that there's already massive scrutiny on the police force, that the police force always needs to listen to public scrutiny because that's the only way they can have compliance and avoid using excessive force, which threatens their own jobs and might put them in jail. Given this, even if the police force is actually like firing black individuals who don't necessarily go against their minority community, then it's a lot easier to hold them accountable. We'd argue that most of the abuse in the police system is implicit. It's not explicitly telling them to target these minorities. And when there's explicit resistance of these orders, it's not like the police force will be so adamant to say, no, attack that minority. It's just not good or doesn't make sense from an optics perspective. But even in the very best case of affirmative, where they succeed and less state security people are created, why is this still bad? Because two arguments which are still unresponded. Firstly, about the self-fulfilling prophecy, the fact that people will be less trustful of the state. The extent to which they've responded to this is to say, oh no, you just hate cops, but this does not respond to our layered analysis. We told you that cops are the ones who enforce the legitimacy of all other state institutions. They're the ones who enforce your following of the law and not committing crimes. So if you hate those kinds of individuals, you're distrustful of all of the apparatus that the state puts in place, such as also like filing for your identification to get other kinds of jobs. So they can't simply lazily throw out that they just hate cops. They have to break down the layered analysis. It's far too late for third act. But secondly, there's no strength of numbers from those existing within, so we can't improve the system. They give up, and they make it easier for all of the change that Black Lives Matter that has created to regress backwards because there's no continuous presence in the community. But more importantly, the fact that you're going to fracture the community, people will always still do it anyway. No response to how we told you that some people will be passionate, and no matter how much they respect the members of their own community, if they feel like their community doesn't support them, they're more likely to just still join the police force, except reluctantly, right? What is the impact of this? We flip all of their harms. It's more likely that minorities will turn their backs on their communities and get brainwashed by the police force when they get no support for them, for their dreams, for their passions, for their monetary incentives. Existing minorities would be truly brainwashed. There would be truly no power for them in the police system. All of their harms are exacerbated. You have to negate. Thanks.
I thank the speaker for their speech. Would now like to call in the third affirmative.
I'm going to assume I'm audible, and I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Both teams agree that this debate is about, trying to prevent harms to the community. So that's where I spend most of my time. But before that, I want to flag that there were still two things that mattered to you. And that was firstly about preventing the future generation of your community, which has faced continual violence throughout its existence, protecting that generation from certain death in the line of duty, right? And the second thing was about how you wouldn't want to legitimize the state's apparatus for punishment by giving them your own youth to go enforce that punishment, right? We don't think we've heard a real response for those. Those things are good for building the margin for us. There are going to be 3 points in my speech. Firstly, about increased hostilities. Secondly, about the harm of these people joining the police. And thirdly, about change on either side of the house. Firstly, increased hostility. There has been a characterization debate about, how much minorities currently distrust the community, right? What we tell you is that it's false that the communities,
just have blind faith in the system because they're obviously aware of historical injustices. They're very angry about them, and they're angry about the fact that there's been no change, even in the wake of Black Lives Matter riots. Second negative's only response is that, oh, minorities today are not affected by historical prejudice. And then they say, oh, and also because you face racism, you don't want to stereotype others. In response to historical prejudice, you as a minority today are obviously aware of historical prejudice and injustice because you live in a tight-knit, family-based community, right? So you know about the pain that your parents and grandparents face. And even if they're a little bit too shy to talk about it all the time, you see the impacts of that trauma in the way that they are scared of the police. They are scared of police dogs, right? That's something that is obvious to you. But even if that's not the case, I would say that today the youth are very politically active, and as a way of trying to maintain, those communities and young generations, there are lots of activists on Instagram who talk about the injustices which minorities face, right? Like, I think the youth are politically active in minority communities particularly. But in response to how you don't want to be prejudiced against the police because you face racism yourself, clearly this is not the same, because the police literally brutalized your people, right? You were not doing the same by distrusting them. That's not something that you're going to make, right? But also I'd say unclear that that's even your natural reaction. People are angry at the fact that they were abused, and rightfully so. But even if you don't believe this characterization, I'm going to tell you why none of the harms about increased hostility actually accrue. So the first harm they've talked about is how, you'll just turn to crime instead because you don't buy into the police. And obviously what we tell you is that not buying into the police does not mean that you disagree with the state as a whole. Second negative's response here is to say that, oh, the state is the tool, the police and the military are the tools that the state use to enforce their policies. That's not true. They are only the tool that the state used to enforce punishments for not following the criminal law. But actually, the state does a lot of things that don't require punishment, right? They just fund public schools. They set policies for how the economy works, for example. So those things have nothing to do with the criminal law and with the state's, military and the police. And that means you don't necessarily stop buying in. But also, in terms of the fact that, youth might become more violent, firstly, I would say that's not true, because when you discourage youth from joining the police, it's probably because you care about their safety. So you say, hey, you should be careful around the police and you should protect yourself. So instead of encouraging the young people in your community to go out and get themselves killed, you encourage them to maybe not talk too much to the police, to know their rights, to be silent, and to not get themselves into situations where they might encounter the police. But also unclear why necessarily minorities becoming more, suspicious of the police is the tipping point that changes the way that a racist institution treats you. Clearly, they don't win at that point. Second point then about the harms of joining the police. I just want to clear up that this material doesn't depend on us proving that minorities make up a huge proportion of the police force, right? They are just a certain group of the police force that are particularly harmful to have for unique reasons. And even if some of them still join despite our active discouragement, that's okay, because we think very few would continue despite that active discouragement, right? Because of the importance of community, because of the importance of what your elders say to you. That was stuff we said out of Umbar. Unclear that anyone is going to continue to join these groups after this clear active discouragement, right? So how are they going to act? We told you that they're going to act badly for 5 reasons. Firstly, that they get indoctrinated in training. Secondly, that there are just personal incentives to get a promotion. Thirdly, that they want to prove themselves to their white colleagues. But fourthly, that when the community turns on them, they have no other options but to, really buy into that tight-knit policing or military community. The response we've heard from the other team is that, oh, the community won't turn on them because they clearly weigh off the benefits to an individual, because they obviously only wanted to join the police because they might go to university, so they won't blame the individual. 2 responses. Firstly, I don't think you care about individuals that much, when they are literally shooting down people in your neighborhood. I think you are forgiving up until the point they are complicit in abusing your people. But secondly, I don't think the benefits are actually good enough to justify this. Like, for example, if you join the police, it's not like you'll go to college. That's only true for the military, right? So I think it's hard for you to justify them making that decision. But the final mechanism we had was about how often minority members of communities have inside knowledge, right? You speak Spanish, so you can eavesdrop on people when you're trying to deport them, right? You know where the immigrants are in your town. You know who's probably most likely to give you information. We think that is a huge harm when you tell those people to join communities. The other team has had, one or 2 responses. So firstly, they've talked about empathy. 2 reasons why empathy doesn't work. Firstly, because you would only empathize with that group insofar as you still feel connected to them, right? I've already proved to you that the community is likely to turn on you, but also you spend like 8 hours a day in like a cop car with your white partner, it's highly unlikely that you empathize with them over trying to protect your white partner who is, also at risk of being shot in a police shootout, for example. So unclear why you empathize with that group over the group that you spend your immediate time with, right? But secondly, often in violent, stressful jobs, you have to compartmentalize because there was always a fear that you'll lose your life. So that means you're not actually an emotional being when you're on the job. Second negative talks about people who join because they really want to act better. Maybe those are the individuals that join anyways, despite active discouragement. Unclear why that's a harm then. Finally, talking about change. First negative concedes that you probably don't make up the majority of the police force as a minority, right? But then they say that if there are more minorities, you can successfully lodge complaints. Several reasons why this is wrong. Firstly, it assumes you're not all indoctrinated, right? And the crucial thing here is they don't just hire in a swathe of new Black Americans into the police force at once and like let them all have their woke little opinions and rally. What they do is they split them up into different districts. They put them in 6-week training camps where they are surrounded by white individuals. And over that process, they become indoctrinated and it's hard for them to ever form a majority, right? And they do that because the white institutions do not want to disempower themselves. But secondly, even if you get bottom-up change, it isn't enough because of the hierarchy within these institutions, right? Look at the way martial courts work. Look at the way that police unions protect police from ever being taken to court or facing external pressure. We don't think that changes. What we told you instead was that firstly, you prevent these institutions by avoiding blame, by blaming Black individuals for over-policing, but also you prevent them from choosing the easy way out by just hiring more people of color and force them to produce actual change, right? And when second negative says the police always give into public scrutiny, we think if that's true, they only do it to the extent it doesn't inconvenience them, right? So you try hire more Black cops in America because you want to look like you're woke. But what would actually happen on our side of the house is when you can no longer hire Black officers, you actually have to give into pressure to defund the police or to disarm at least, or to leave your your pistols and your guns in your car. Those are the kinds of changes which you are more likely to see in our house. You don't give them an easy way out, which doesn't solve anything. But even if you don't change the police from within, obviously minorities will still be politically engaged, will still vote, and you can get change that way. Thank you.
Thank you, speaker. I'd now like to call in the third negative speaker.
Hello, am I audible?
You are then.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I have a cold. Okay. Three issues in today's debate. Firstly, how will you treat your own minority? Secondly, the likelihood of abuse. Thirdly, harms or benefits to the child. And then later I'll talk about how they're unresponsive to our biggest push and that cost in the debate. But before that, I want to deal with two questions up in characterization. The first being is, do we have sufficient mitigation for the worst cases of abuse to the minority community inside and outside the system? The only response we heard from second speaker was, police unions are as strong as ever. And the only response we heard, like just last seconds of the previous speaker's speech, was if they always cared about public perception, they're likely to do it in tokenistic ways. This is factually untrue. There are more cases that have been filed that sets up more precedents to jail police officers. This is a trend we've been seeing. They're given less money by federal governments. Some states are even funding community watches instead because they want a defunded police. Third, Affirmative actually concedes this when they say that when they concede the increase of activism within the youth. Therefore, they do have to care because notice how the police and other institutions are all public institutions, which is their legitimacy and their functionality depends on public perception. That's if Frame introduced the first speaker, no response. But secondly, just to solidify that point, public perception does matter a lot to these institutions because we give them autonomy if people can trust them. We justify their budget on the basis that we know that they'll use their budget properly. Media coverage is hyper-focused on abuses and corruption within these institutions. People are reporting on these abuses at an all-time high. These institutions pressured to show reform in order to increase their budget or escape punishment. All of these were all unresponded to, which you introduced at first speaker. The second question I want to answer then is, how will this be taught? We told you very clearly you're likely to highlight very emotional cases, like how your father got killed, how your mother got mistreated, how your neighbors got shot. Affirmative has to concede this, by the way, because they have to make sure that children will never go to these offices, which you can only do when you create a strong personal reason not to that outweighs any economic or security benefits. They have to concede this or they don't get any of their benefits. But the second thing I want to clarify is that kids don't understand the structural reasons for why things happen. What they understand is that the policemen hurt their family, which is is reinforced by their community by active discouragement. What they understand most is the pain and anger that they feel, which often leads to resentment and all the harms of disobedience we highlighted. So their attack at our counter or at our mechanism for why this is true was just say that children can understand it, they can distinguish it. That wasn't the analysis to prove that we had resentment. Therefore, you still have to believe that resentment is likely. On to the first issue then. How will you treat your own minority? What did they say? Firstly, at first speaker, they said that they prey on kids to get jobs. I just want to deal with the counter model first, because the counter model is that we tell children they have better economic opportunities. Notice how communities already do this in status quo on both worlds. They try to send as much kids to college as possible. They try to bring them as much job fairs, introduce as much economic opportunities as possible. This means that if these kids enter these jobs, it's not because they can access these alternatives. In fact, they probably can't. Because of structural barriers, like for example, maybe they just don't have that good of an education. So if this is the soft stance that they defend, the same amount of people still end up in the military and police, so all of their harms are symmetric. But moreover, I just want to say this is unimportant, right? Because accounting, investment banking, like all other industries, also prey on kids and try to appeal to them using different things. Just in this instance, it's probably money. So it's not an exclusive standard for discouragement. The second thing that they try to say is that there's used in pernicious ways, which means that you will harm your minority. Firstly, this actually goes against the next layer they give at first speaker about how the state showcases minorities to dodge accountability. Because if it is true that this is the case, it means all eyes are on these minorities within the police. It means they can't just act harsher with their own people because it's likely to be reported. And when they're asked or questioned by the media, they can blame it on their boss. Moreover, they have to show that minorities are being treated well within these institutions, especially when media is starting to penetrate these institutions and get far more coverage on these instances. Notice how black cops are getting more and more interviews talking about their situation. They have an incentive to treat these people well. But the second thing to note here is that assuming this is true, there are ways you can escape it. Like your superior officer won't watch you every day. So in the instance where, for example, they're not watching you on that one mission, you can still show empathy like we described. You can still help that one minority that otherwise would have not been helped if it was a completely white police force. The next thing that they try to give is some inside information about how you just understand the language. Firstly, third affirmative directly contradicts this. When they say that there's an incentive to split them up to different communities to decrease empathy, if that is true, then you're a black person, for example, put in a white community. I don't understand how you can get any inside information from that. But the second thing to note here is that you can always just choose not to report it. Like, for example, if like you see a couple of African Americans or, for example, Latinos talking, you can always, for example, tell your boss what like a different story. You're not like at all legally required, or they won't know if you're lying to them. So I'm not particularly sure as to why this is even true. Weigh that against what we said, which is empathy. They had two responses to this. Firstly, the community will turn on you. I will deal with that in a bit, and as to why discouragement is actually the tipping point for hostility against like these police officers. But the second thing to note here is that the only response you have is you're not an emotional being when you're on the job. I actually argue this is not true, especially when they characterize at first speaker. These are tightly knit communities. That means that you value what your like parents or what your grandparents taught you a lot. Therefore, even if in some instances you can't at all be emotional because you're with your boss, and in some instances where you are alone, or for example, you are patrolling with a person that can similarly apply to your instance, you can be emotional with the people that you're with. This at all was not a sufficient a line of analysis, and in fact, their own characterization took it down. On the second clash of likelihood of abuse, what did they say? Firstly, you lose connection with your community and you're seen as a traitor. I just want to note this is contingent on your community shunning you. If we solve that, then this has no more impact and it falls to us. I actually argue that discouragement makes it far worse when it is getting better. What are the current trends in status quo we have been seeing? They characterize these minorities as being tightly knit at first affirmative. This means that the members of your community relate why you entered, will have an incentive to try to understand you and not jump to assumptions. Moreover, if you're truly part of a tightly knit small community, there is a disincentive to kick people out because you're already small. But secondly, being seen as a traitor or feeling disconnected is unlikely. You still see your family. Even if you don't, you recognize them as people who sacrifice so much for you, so you're likely to value the things they told you, even over, for example, the indoctrination. Like you can just tell your police officer that you hate African Americans, you don't actually have to believe it or manifest it. Why does discouragement then make it worse? And this is the extension we brought up that had little to no response from the previous speaker. You increase stigma against people who are currently in the system or people who want to join. We proved this why it will manifest as resentment. That makes it that the people that you are stigmatizing get even far worse because you make them feel more disconnected the moment you do discouragement. Therefore, more crimes are happening against your minority community. We win over that impact. What are the responses to our case here? The first thing that they try to say is that protection against abuses in line. They try to wait at the end, right? Like we protect the abuses in that line of duty. There are a couple of reasons as to why we outweigh this. Firstly, there are still minorities within these offices. You make their treatment far, far worse. So there may be less people, but the degree of abuse becomes a lot higher. So in that instance, you'd rather earn the people who are trapped there already, given first affirmative's reason as to why you can just jump institution. But the second thing is that this can be co-opted. If you increase more hostility against your community, which means more violence, so what that means is that you maybe protect the ones in the police or the ones who would have not joined the police, but you don't protect the people in the community because you increase hostility. So on that metric, we can still win on their benefit. Last clash then, the harms or benefits the actual child and when they grow up. What did they say? In terms of response, they tried to say you can distinguish state services and state security. Firstly, this is not true. A lot of minorities likely characterized because they have such historical anger against the generation of police. A manifestation of this is that a lot of minorities actually don't vaccinate because they're speculative of the state and that the state might insert microchips in them because of the incident that happened in the 60s. What this means is that even if you can see that the anger is true, people cannot at all control that anger. What they feel is they just hate the state, even if it's not the police. They still feel like the government or the administration is out to get them, which is like they can't get good jobs. Or it's like, for example, that they're not passing any policies to better their life. In that instance, you still hate the state as a whole. But secondly, they didn't respond to our impacts about how state security apparatuses get worse. On that note, they harm not only the individual, but the community at large for those reasons, and their unresponsiveness both negative.
I thank the speaker for this speech. Would now like to call in the negative reply.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I really like the strategy I learned from the Austral scene, which is having multiple win strategies. And I'll show you why we have many of them that are still mostly unresponded. I will not concede we lose the others, but I don't need to beat the dead horse. Third negative already did it. So I'll highlight everything else you need to consider on the panel. First issue, hatred and injustices. Whether or not the children will hate the state security to begin with, or how the hatred gets reversed. We disputed their characterization, which is whether or not the children will always hate the state or the minorities will always hate the state, by weighing the likelihood, which they never do. They simply try to restate the reasons and add layers when in reality we can weigh even 5 layers of analysis out with our 3. Firstly, when we said there's a romanticized narrative of how the police can embody justice, so yeah, the fact that the system itself is still workable, it's the people that you might need to hate. And secondly, the monetary incentives that is existed for the whole community, which you can develop once you access the opportunities given here. We weighed their hatred of cops out by saying, okay, the hope of the child to improve the very system and reduce this hatred can overrule that hatred. We even co-opted that hatred, so when said you can hate the cops that did the bad things, but you can also support your children who want to become cops by just saying you don't be like those cops, you can isolate those things. We co-opt that harm. But our other win condition, again, was to say, even if they do hate the state, will they be productive for them? This is where we have our self-fulfilling prophecy argument about how you're very, firstly, you make them so emotional to the point that they're irrational when they constantly evoke and expect that they're going to be, that the trauma from the past is going to be repeated again, even when the police are not yet acting on aggression, that they're necessarily going to fall into harmful patterns of behavior, patterns like crime patterns such as resisting state apparatus. At best, the only mitigation they gave was to say, okay, maybe other apparatus such as public education won't be resisted, they'll still get jobs, but the worst impact, which we told you about, is crime, which is inherently tied to the police, and they never disputed this. They are still more likely to do things such as rebel against authority or commit crimes because they don't think that the people enforcing them can be trusted regardless. So the worst outcomes are still symmetric. Another win condition here, however, was to ask, does it address the actor? Because even insofar as we concede that perhaps the police officer, the guy who becomes a police officer, might eventually become disenfranchised, we told you that it increases tension with the law enforcement, right? Because you are so antagonistic and all of a sudden you spread this narrative about how state security is bad within your community, and there's no interaction with those communities except for when they're trying to investigate crimes, then therefore the police will be resentful against your minority community, and then your actor in the debate will be more like antagonized as a result, or less safe. Secondly, where do we change the system? We told you that it's about having a tangible mechanism of change, and their counterfactual doesn't stand whatsoever. Because the extent of their counterfactual is to say we can still be politically engaged and do Black Lives Matter, but they mitigate their own harms and benefits because they say that, oh, the passive movements in status quo are fine, but at the same time, they rail on us by saying you haven't created any tangible change yet, therefore we should just give up on creating change. Realize that, okay, fine, negative hasn't solved all the problems with systemic, I don't know, like racism or whatever against minorities. There's still a long way to go. At least there's a path to improvement. There's a tangible way to fight the fight. If it is as hard as they say, then we need as much strength within the system as possible. And there's a win condition for us there. We can capitalize on the change in movements so that even when media capture dies on their side, which we told you happens, we can still have that presence within the movement and and force the system to reform. But just a bunch of extraneous things we can win on as well. On terms of indoctrination, it's highly unlikely because we're the only team who frames the likelihood of incentives of these police officers. What do they care about more? Their generic framing that people want money never evolves across other speakers when we had multiple layers. We told you the people who are affected by active discouragement are the ones who are passionate about becoming cops. Again, that they'll be able to resist the monetary incentives and stay committed to justice. Also, the fact that, again, the monetary incentives for these communities cannot be is a standing benefit for everyone else. Even if everything is a wash, you have to believe these extraneous things. You have to negate.
I thank the speaker for the speech. Would now like to call in the affirmative reply.
Awesome. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If you look to the specific changes in police structures that Third Neg discusses, I think you'd have to do lots of digging to find out how a few Black cops on the beat created all of the changes that occurred after Black Lives Matter. Because by Second Neg's own admission, these were the result of public scrutiny that cops could not hide from. At the end of 28 minutes of speaking time, I still can't find a single explanation in the negating team's case as to how cops within these institutions have ever changed the very policy they want to achieve. But I understand why they pivot to trying to claim some of our accountability benefits, because they don't actually demonstrate the likelihood of these cops being incredibly empathetic given all of the other structures that apply to them, or the harms and scale of increased hostility they try to win on. So what I'm going to discuss in this reply is just very clearly the harms that accrue to the community and the reasons why a community member would not want a minority joining those structures, and finally explaining how incentives for change work. Before that, though, just one clarifying note, which I think deals with a lot of the material that comes out in the dying minutes of that neg reply, which is to say, this narrative obviously works to stop the minorities that are currently being coerced into joining, not because they have an immense passion for joining ICE or the police, but because they are told it is their only way out of oppressive structures that apply on them. The community obviously acts to protect those people from joining these structures. Do communities mistrust these institutions currently? And the first thing I would flag is just that Ateneo is quite unstrategic in how they respond to this material, right? Because I'm sure they have multiple win strategies, but the issue is quite a few of them act in contention to one another. Because on one hand, first and second rely on these communities being these super benevolent victims and not having a natural inclination to trust these institutions. But then at third, they say, well, they already hate these institutions so much they don't take vaccines, so it's unlikely that they'll ever do bad things when they join the police. I think if you believe third, our consistent narrative of the reasons as to why these communities mistrust institutions means that it is likely that you do not want your children joining these institutions, right? Then they rely on communities understanding that these kids who join the cops join them because Firstly, they have this empathy mechanism, which I think we've already dealt with, but also that they rely on these minority cops then acting in better ways than other cops do. This relies on that change mechanism applying though, right? What does this mean for that debate? The first is obviously just to say that communities have legitimate reasons to mistrust these institutions. And for NEG to try and explain the harms of rebelling against authority, I think they actually had to demonstrate how this was a unique tipping point. Shah and Grace do really good work to demonstrate how social services are often seen as incredibly different to punishment tools, but we would also note that probably rioting against bad authorities like you do through protests like Black Lives Matters by own NEG's admission are good things, but they also actually have to prove change. And I think we give you quite good and consistent reasons down the line as to why that doesn't happen. Firstly, training isolates you. Secondly, you compartmentalize. You want to protect your colleagues when you're at work, so you buy into that narrative. Thirdly, if your community thinks you're a traitor or mistrusts you or even looks at you slightly suspiciously, you buy into the support structure you have at work. But finally, hierarchies within the system means that even if you try to change things, incentives exist from higher uppers to make sure nothing changes. The new analysis at third NEG is about how the media will now focus on Black cops in order to make change. The issue is they still want to make the link towards change in the community, right? The media isn't going to blame a Black cop for any issues because that looks bad reputationally. But for all the analysis we give you, a Black cop is also not going to blame their boss who employs them because that comes at a personal risk. So even if you don't buy any of the analysis we give you on indoctrination or desire to fit in with your institutional friends when your community turns against you, the very career development mechanism that you do not want to get fired from your stable job means that you don't get that scrutiny from within. All of this means that you are unlikely to affect change on your side, but that the community suffers harm when you fit in by giving away information to ICE, by selling people out. As a member of the community, you obviously want these harms to stop from accruing. We get that best change.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I thank everyone for the debate. I think results will be announced later in a separate Zoom meeting. I'd request the panel to